Tonight we have one of the most brilliant and wide-ranging editors who has held the most powerful jobs in broadcasting and in print journalism, Sarah Sands. Good evening, Sarah.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us in this fireside Great Lives, Great Mind series of 70 consecutive people talking about what's made them who they are. Can I say to those who are new to this program tonight, Sarah will have brought many followers with you, devotees, that you are very welcome. You're also very welcome to ask questions. Just tap in questions, and if you cannot, if you're unable to tap them in, just send them osmotically. I'll pick them up. Sarah, tell us, just to begin with, we always do this, where are you and what does this intriguing, fascinating room say about you?
Do you love its bareness? It's brand new is one thing, and this is like a proper office, and in pandemic times that's quite exciting, and it's also a sign, I think, of a sort of quite a bracing return to the real world. There are no mice here, as there were, of course, at New Broadcasting House at the BBC, and it's well positioned near Westminster. And this is because it's a corporate strategy company called Hawthorne Advisors, and so my role there is to try, forgive the hubris, but to have a go at trying to rebuild the economy a bit. So we're there trying to find sort of businesses and backing them, and so I love this office.
And well, that's the most important activity. Many congratulations too on you becoming chair of the think tank Bright Blue, and we'll talk about that later on, and indeed about your 3 novels and much else. But Sarah, the influence of your home background, to be brought up in Tunbridge Wells is not the most obvious home background for someone who is going to come on and take such strong senior positions across the media. What did Tunbridge Wells do for you?
Well, it sort of fired me with a great determination to leave Tunbridge Wells. I apologise for that. It was such a great place, but at the time
we have a big following. Can I just say to Tunbridge Wells, from Tunbridge Wells supporters?
Oh well, no. Good evening, Tunbridge Wells. But if you are, yes, sort of young and punk rock has just hit Britain, Tunbridge Wells wasn't the kind of the first place to choose. So I went to I went instead to a university that was known as that was described as screaming tires rather than dreaming spires. So I loved that. That was Goldsmith College in South London. So that was my great sort of act of
rebellion.
Yes.
And you studied what?
I studied English and drama.
And so drama, I'm sure that everyone will know that Sarah is the sister of the equally celebrated and exceptional Kit Hesketh Harvey. So just tell us a bit about Kit and what is that drama strand in the family all about?
I'm not sure. We've got some sort of opera singers in the that go back a bit, and then some just rather sort of women of theatrical nature. So there seem to be long-suffering churchy men, and then these sort of difficult theatrical women, the ancestor we were very proud of, I think, is a great great grandfather who had a lily named after him, a Hudson lily, which was the inspiration for Monet and the pond and the bridge and so on. That was all him. So men represent, as I say, sort of calm and patience. Women are all sort of queen of the night, and I think Kit probably got the queen of the night end.
You must, if you're unfamiliar with his work, look him up now or as soon as this is over on YouTube, and you'll see what a rare talent that was, and indeed a whole number of very unusual people came out of that very traditional school, Tunbridge School in Kent, which is where he went, and indeed where I went also. So Sarah, I guess you first became widely known to the public at large when in '96 you became deputy editor on the Daily Telegraph to Charles Moore. Can you tell us about what was it in your career that led you to that point? And did you imagine that you were going to be doing this? From Goldsmiths to the Daily Telegraph, not an obvious journey.
Well, in a way, it was a sort of return to Tunbridge Wells roots, wasn't it? Because when I joined, and I remember, I think, some people saying, "Oh, it's like the sort of bishop and an actress," and you know, why? So I'd come into this, you know, this apparently very sort of traditional world of the Telegraph, and I said, you know, you don't need to teach me anything. I am from Tunbridge Wells, and so many of the readers were, of course, from Tunbridge Wells too. So actually, I had a very, very happy time there, because it was when Charles was there, but also Bill Deeds, Lord Deeds, who was a sort of huge influence, and the sort of sensibility of Lord Deeds, which was always rather sort of playful. So people think of it as being a, you know, sort of stern ideological paper, and it really wasn't. And Charles had, in a way, a sort of university sort of suppleness of just wanting debate. So the leader conferences, which drove everyone mad, but they went on for hours. So, you know, you'd have poor old
just to tell us, we have a lot of our journalism students.
Yes.
Here at the University of Buckingham and from all around the country looking tonight. Just tell us what that is, the Leader Conference, and how did Charles Moore in particular structure the day? When were key decisions made about the front page and the comment pages and the leaders?
Sure, and the Leader Conference is the conference where you discuss issues of the day, and you write on the what's known as the leader page, which is the comment page, what the newspaper thinks. So that for papers like the Telegraph and the Times have always been, you know, tremendously significant, that you clear your throat and you say, you know, what matters. And it still has that tone, even though perhaps the influence of newspapers are much less. The sense of this is what we think, and you would think that the Telegraph again would be of a very sort of thundering style, but at the time it was a lot more playful, and part of that was the sort of strange cast. The executives so you had Charles Moore, you had me, Boris Johnson, who was there, who wrote quite a few of the leaders, and he and Charles would talk about whether they could construct them, you know, according to the sort of classical rules of rhetoric and so on. And what you have to remember, while this all went on, outside you've got a long queue, which is a news conference and news, you know, rather urgent matter of the day, being kept waiting while this sort of leader conference went on sort of for hours. But I think because Charles wanted it to go a bit like the sort of Cambridge Union or debating society, actually, so that it was always, so he wanted to listen to all the arguments. And I often think of those. I think of those when, for instance, there was the moment when Boris Johnson had to choose, you know, was he remain or was he leave? And that he'd said he wrote 2 articles, and it seemed a sort of peculiar, you know, rather theoretical thing to be doing. But in fact, You know, in a way I thought, well, he's just reconstructing those leader conferences. If you hear one argument and you hear another, and that the great art of a leader writer is to make the argument that you know, against what you believe. It's when you can make a convincing argument for the other side that you get extra points, and then, you know, even cleverer to knock it down.
And did Boris Johnson even back then believe in anything, Sarah?
At the time, I remember while I was there, there was a leadership contest where the Telegraph, I think, backed the not entirely successful Ian Duncan Smith on purity grounds, and Boris Johnson went for Ken Clarke, who I think he sort of saw in his image. So I think in the sense of that he was a sort of liberal at the time, sort of liberal conservative, who didn't want to get, you know, too much, wasn't very fussed about how people led their lives personally, and would rather and make up his mind at the last minute. I think that was the thing. So I was also oversaw the comment pages, and that meant that you know, I had to see that the columns were written on time and so on. And it was also always tremendously frustrating with Boris Johnson because he was always the last to file. But that was partly because, you know, that was part of his the final flourish of making up his mind and saying, no, that's what I think. And so I think, you know, one had to wait a bit for him to decide what he thought.
Simon Heffer famously was exasperated by his lateness, but did you keep Boris under check? Was he afraid of you?
No, because he really had no sense of authority. I think it was Charles Moore who said really he had to be Prime Minister in the end because it was the only job, you know, he can do, because you can't subvert yourself, you know, so perhaps you can. So I think he just was his own rules. I did sometimes, you know, I would sort of storm into Charles Moore and say, that's it, you know, you have to say the page is gone and he has to be punished and he isn't going to appear. And Charles would say, yes, you know, we have to say that, but we can't because, you know, he's the draw. And so why would you go without his column? And in a way, you know, it's the same arguments still going, that, you know, that he's the great entertainer, and so that's the difficulty with him, you know, for all his flaws.
The paper at that time was remorselessly anti John Major. I'd remember he'd often say at that time, have you seen what the Telegraph has said about me? Have you seen what Simon Heffer or Charles Moore has said about me? And then the paper was quite excited about Tony Blair. Do you want to describe what the thinking was there? Why would the arch Tory Telegraph turn its back on the Tory Prime Minister and fawn over a Labour incomer?
I came quite late to all that, but I think it must be the American influence, so that he was seen to be sound on America and American foreign policy. So he was a sort of spine stiffener, and I think that at the time the sort of neocons were thought to be rather sort of exhilarating, you know, the idea that you could sort of remake the world, which is quite in some ways a quite non-conservative notion, you know, that all that the sort of interventionism and so on. But I think it was about the special relationship.
This was really a bumper time for the Telegraph, with Charles Moore, a brilliant editor, Max Hastings. Do you want to say anything about that, Sarah? But also picking up on your comment there about it being a heyday of the print media. When was the heyday of the newspaper, and when and why did that start declining?
No, I sort of look back with such nostalgia at the figures, you know, thinking that you absolutely took a circulation of 1 million, you know, for granted. And that actually I think there was sort of probably more potential within the kind of within Charles Moore's worldview. You know, one of the sort of, you know, amusing moments I remember was that he had this big idea for a promotion for the papers to raise circulation, and that would be to do a history of Christianity. And actually, he did it in conjunction with Neil McGregor, so imagine, you know, how good it was. But the marketing people at the time were horrified because, you know, you were meant, as forever onwards, you were meant to be appealing to young people, and why would Christianity appeal to people, to young people? So I think the compromise was in the end that it had to be called AD, because they thought that sounded
more sexy.
Cooler, yeah. The AD could be a bit like TK Maxx or something, you know. So, but it was, anyway, it did so well for the Telegraph, and I think it was that idea of actually, you know, an editor, you have to believe in the editor, you know. So they were often, there was a sense of trying to steer Charles away from his own instincts, but actually, you know, his instincts ended up being very commercial. And when you didn't, so the newsroom would sometimes sort of fight against him. I remember the point about your day as an editor is that you you know, you look at the front page and then you go home, but the evening continues, so the night editor will let you know if something happens, and they don't always. So I always remember a front page that when Charles went home, it had a front page picture of about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and when he came in the morning, it was a picture of Jodie Richardson in a evening gown. And I think it was just, you know, that was just the sort of news trying to you know, always sort of modernize or go for, and you know, at the time, thinking of things that have changed, you know, one thing was that the decorative purpose of women in newspapers was quite, now seems, you know, very old-fashioned. If in doubt, I mean, it's not unlearned anymore, but, you know, you just stick on a picture of a woman with not too many clothes on, whatever the context. And I think the sort of the stock of women all dressed up, I notice, you know, occasionally if I've you know, got into trouble or attracted attention, and there's a piece about me in the newspapers, it's always me in an evening dress and that kind of thing, even if it, you know, was about what's happening on the Today programme. I promise you, I never came to the Today programme wearing an evening dress, but that idea that you sex up, you know, women you know, for decorative purposes remains kind of true.
So was this, just on that question, was this the heyday under Hastings and under Charles Moore of the Telegraph? It then seemed to lose its way for a whole number of years, maybe recovering now, but also the influence, Sarah, of the newspapers. Was it just the numbers, and why did the numbers of sales start declining?
Well, it was certainly based on the numbers, you know, so I think it was, so you knew you were, you know, reaching a very big audience, so it, you know, it mattered, or readership, as I said before, the Today programme, yeah, so the numbers were significant, and there was also, you know, a sense of sort of serious exchanges. So when I became editor of the Sunday Telegraph, you know, it was sort of minutes, you know, before you were, you know, invited into Downing Street, and that your, you know, that your opinion seemed to matter, and what, you know, whereas now it is much more obviously sort of fragmented, and well, both fragmented but also targeted. So I think the relationship with Downing Street, you know, is according to relevance, and it may be that they so they choose a journalist with specific influence. I notice Harry Cole on the Sun is you know, is the sort of chosen person at the moment, and so it's not in the, so you don't quite have that sense of, you know, the editor is the figure that you go to, and needs to be persuaded. You know, that's another thing.
And what did Tony Blair say to you when you saw him?
I think that was Gordon Brown actually by then, and I think it was, you know, sort of what are the things that mattered to me, and you know what was my view on certain things, and I think so it's, you know, it's a sort of exhilarating, you know, the children you know have sort of bought in and so on, and so I think it's this son, and I think it's so I think it's that sense of being taken into confidence, which is you know, which is obviously very calculated. You would know about all, you know, how that works.
So the students want to know about the influence of the proprietor. So when you became the first female editor of the Sunday Telegraph, how much influence did the owners of the Telegraph Group have on you, and how was that exerted?
Well, you know, what often happens is that editors, by great coincidence, have similar views to the proprietor. I think in the case of the Telegraph, so my big sin, well, you know, sin, error, judgment, whatever, on the Sunday Telegraph, I think, was failing to understand the sort of the managing up. So one thing is that sometimes proprietors don't like you to be having, you know, too much, but you're having too much fun, actually. You know, they see you, you know, you're talking to all the politicians, you're meeting all the people. And so there was a bit of sense of wanting to sort of keep tabs on you. So I think, you know, the art is more sort of, you know, reporting. I remember, actually, I think every proprietor I work for always seemed to bring up non-dom status, you know, and kind of, so that was, you know, so it wasn't something actually I sort of raised at Downing Street, but it was something that sort of preyed on their minds.
And these were the Barclays.
The Barclays, and so and I think with the Barclays particularly that they were that they valued discretion very highly. So I remember, and actually the person that I dealt with, actually they were fine when I dealt with them. There was a sort of there was a boss no longer there who you know, very much wanted sort of control of all access and so on. And I used to just write these rather breezy emails saying, oh, do you really think this? Or I'm surprised to hear this, or whatever, as if it was an open exchange. And each time, you know, it would take about 5 minutes and he would run down the stairs to say, you know, will you stop putting this in email? So I think sort of, yeah, discretion was the main thing, which obviously journalists aren't always great at.
So the first female editor of the Sunday Telegraph, which was a huge thing, and also one of the shortest serving editors of the Sunday Telegraph. So that was significantly because you didn't grovel enough to the Barclay brothers and didn't do enough about what they wanted. You had too many of your own ideas, did you, Sarah, as an editor for the paper?
Well, I think there was, I think I was probably a little bit ill-disciplined in that sense that I guess I've always had, I think, you know, tremendous sort of loyalty and affection for the people I'm working with, and they were a brilliant team, I think. And also I sort of took the brief, which was, you know, to move audiences from here to here, and do and to, you know, sort of revamp the paper. So I went at that with great sort of gusto. I think then there's a sort of fear of it's, you know, because the thing about proprietors or, you know, other powerful people, I guess, is, you know, that if you're not talking to them, other people will. So I think, you know, there will be critics of mine who would speak to them, and I think some of the criticisms, you know, fair enough, and some was just sort of misconstrued. So the example that I give was when I was there was a criticism passed on, I think, through the bosses, from a reader saying I turned the comment pages into sex and shopping. and I went and looked at them, and that was so it was Robert Harris on Pompeii, Stephanie Flanders was on shopping because it was the future of the economy. Niall Ferguson I hired, and I sort of looked at them and thought, that's not really a representation of what this is. But you can always, you know, once you've decided that you've, so I've always been kind of interested in impressions, in, you know, whether you're, who's defining you and who's defining what you're doing is quite an interesting one, because there's always going to be people who are, you know, upset because they don't fit with the new regime.
Questions about editing a Sunday as opposed to a daily newspaper. Can you describe how you, as editor of the Sunday Telegraph, organised your week? I mean, did you put your feet up until Friday evening and then just zip along and sort it out on Saturday? Or
that's always a question. That's a brilliantly management question. It was the first thing that they asked, was cool. So hang on. So what happens between Tuesday and Friday? And I think the what happens with daily, you know, all daily news is that there's a sort of wave of news, you know, stuff's happening. You know, there's an announcement about COVID figures or whatever now. For Sundays, you know, which what I liked about them was that you should really try and find your own news, and there's much more of a sense of that being sort of original or investigative or long write-throughs, or so it's more fun to do in a way. But it also means that it can be very frustrating, because if a big story breaks on Tuesday, it could be just sort of all hoovered up by Friday. So then there are moments where you're floundering, and oddly sometimes you can have a paper that's perfect and everything original and balanced, and then something happens on a Saturday night that you can't even do that well, but that is, you know, is an event that you have to cover, and that's quite annoying. Then you just have to sort of throw everything away. But it's rare. Used to be that you had some advantages, you know, bad for city, although again good for original city journalism, bad for, you know, that you don't hit the sort of morning deadline, but very good for sport. Less so now because sport's more spread out, but it used to be, you know, all sport was on the Saturday, and so for a Sunday, sports pages were, you know, really important.
You were still the Blair ascendancy was still very evident, and many of the most interesting intellectuals and thinkers were on the left. I mean, the Spectator had become rather a miserable thing, really loved by a small number. But the tide had gone out. What did you do to try to regenerate intellectual excitement on the right of centre, Sarah?
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. I mean, actually, some things was trying to sort of coax more left-wing writers into right-wing themes. So I remember getting a very long sort of 5,000-word essay on the armed forces by Richard Eyre, you know, because actually he did have sort of some military, you know, had a kind of sympathy from. So there was a bit of that, and actually another thing I did on the Saturday Telegraph, I remember that we were always being told that there was this barrier to entry, that you couldn't get actually, you know, in a way, a lot of the sort of mainstream you know, voters into what was seen as quite a narrow right-wing paper. So I started a gardening section because that's your cultural bridge, you know. So I thought, so it was people with, as it were, conservative sensibilities, but who didn't vote Conservative necessarily. On the right wing, you know, some of that was coming from America. Some, actually, Niall Ferguson was someone that I signed, who was a sort of, you know, quite early, and it seemed at the time, you know, sort of quite bracing to be going against the, you know, conventions. And Matt D'Ancona was my deputy editor on the Sunday, who was sort of had a brilliant sense of where the range of thinking was. So I think we did try and mix. And also there was the sort of strange cross currents of sympathies. Actually, within the Conservative Party, people didn't agree, much as you intimated, over the sort of John Major versus other figures. So people like Simon Heffer, would be someone who could just put the boot in from time to time.
And did you try and make it more Catholic? I mean, some might say, I couldn't possibly comment, that if you look at it now, it is and has been for some time full of middle-aged right-wing men saying that Brexit is going to be glorious and do it purely or everything will go wrong. Did you things have actually changed, I think, but how did you try and get more richness and diversity, and were you blocked by from above?
Small C Catholic, presumably, rather than the Charles Moore Catholic.
Absolutely.
His own sensibility.
Our Catholic in the meaning of the word of universal.
Well, again, it was sort of range of writers. So people like that I just thought were very good. Zadie Smith, I remember getting in to do a Madonna concert, which was sort of, cultural, social observation. And I do think that thing which has always interested me at the Today programme too, about, that we sometimes concentrate too narrowly on politics rather than the broader culture. So I think I tried in that sense to get sort of surprising voice. Zadie Smith was very interesting because actually, she's a great supporter of Philip Larkin and lots of people who you don't necessarily come out as left-wing heroes.
So what are you good at, Sarah? Why have you had this illustrious career?
Oh, there's a question. I think I have quite a good news sense, and it's interesting because when
what does that mean? What's a good news sense?
A news sense of what might be about to happen, and where so kind of where stuff's heading, and what the new and I guess that sort of short concentration span of so what's new, what's interesting. Charles Moore said about me, rather haughtily, but I think he's right, that I'm not an intellectual, but I love clever people, and I think I've always sort of sought out clever people and wanted to have them around, and I think that becomes a kind of that delivers a sort of a programme or a newspaper.
Okay, and then you went on to the Mail and became a consultant editor. Now, the Mail has had an extraordinarily powerful influence on prime ministers. It's hard to think of any force that's had more of a say, positive or negative, depending which way you look at it, on the thinking and judgments within Number 10. What is that about? Was that all just Paul Dacre, the long-term editor? And how did it achieve that ascendancy?
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, he did have a tremendous force of personality, and a sort of conviction, and a sense of sort of who he was speaking for. So I guess because I come from rather sort of different traditions, and do you remember Alexander Chancellor on this? So he was, who always said that, he found sort of opinions rather sort of tiresome and vulgar in a way. I've never felt, it's funny enough that though I think I was dreaded at the BBC by some people because I worked for these conservative papers. Actually, one thing I found pretty easy at the BBC was impartiality, because I think I'm always quite interested in the other side. I don't have that, absolutely passionate sense of conviction that Paul Dacre did, which you then, and the point, it was conviction, but what went with it was the work ethic. So it was the execution. So you can have, you can have sort of ideas and things you believe in, but if you've then left the office, I would watch him, and his back, I could see the sort of drops of blood on the back of his shirt because he would just be sort of scratching, and he would still, it still wasn't enough. And every, the line by line and the words that I always sort of associate with him, which were all to do with all to do with sort of, strengthening the message. So so it was a sort of, what was it, a kind of moral fury that he had, on behalf of these people that he felt he represented. And I always wondered with him, that the sort of horror would be that you're with those sort of strivers, and then what happens if they do well, and then, does a kind of, terrible sophistication or sort of, irony kind of come in and ruin it all. I guess it's always been that you'll know this, the worry about sort of generations of success, do you take all the drive out of the next generation?
Yeah, of course. And did he live the life himself? Was he a bully? Was he sexist?
Well, it was of its time. So no, he wasn't. Actually, he wasn't. He was quite shy and polite to women. It was rather like a, sort of, I don't know, sort of commissioner, police commissioner or something. I think partly he looked like, he was sort of big, and he was rather respectful of women, but in terms that we would now find odd. So, he would say, very nice to have me at leader conference. He would call me madam, or sometimes I was a sort of honorary man, and it was a sense that, so it was in a way that you might, talk to older women. Actually, I was quite young at the time, but with that, rather respectful way. I think, was he a bully? Well, in those, that's what newspaper offices were like. So yes, it would be, the air would turn blue, and there would be, so food. But in a way, it was, I think it was a way, that's how news happened. That I wasn't there, but someone who worked for him when he was news editor said, he would literally, when you finished the news list, shout out, "Go Paris, go," to the journalists, and that was the kind of atmosphere that he instilled. And I think, the horror was always that if you got too sort of, if you became too mellow, you lose the fury of the conviction, which gives the paper its power and professionalism. I see I've convinced you.
Well, I'm really asking the questions here, Sarah. You will have convinced, that answer will have convinced many, and perhaps not everybody. It does seem to be odd to have a paper that sets itself up as being very moral, with an editor whose use of language and relationships didn't seem to personify what he was talking about. Would be a comment. You spent a lot of time amongst powerful men who hated the European Union. Did that brush off on you?
Actually, the editor who had a great deal of influence over me, who was during the John Major years, when I was at the Evening Standard, of course, who you would know, I think, was Stuart Stephen. Yeah. And he was, so he was quite the opposite, and he was sort of passionately pro EU. So I think it was really, I guess, it was a sort of, the Telegraph and the Mail. Geordie Gregg I worked with on the Evening Standard, and of course when I edited the Evening Standard, we did, we fought for Remain, and that was, and I always remember the front page on the day of the referendum, where there had been an extraordinary storm and you saw lightning go through Westminster, and it sort of felt seismic in that way. So I've done both.
Was there a commercial interest, do you think, on the part of the Barclays and Rupert Murdoch and Dacre and and others, inclining them towards believing that once out of the EU, it would be a land of milk and honey, that they were reflecting their commercial advantage. And of course, they were the newspapers that swayed the nation.
Yes, well, I'm trying to work out what the commercial advantage would be specifically. You know, you always I always assume with Rupert Murdoch, it's, you know, it's commercial. I think the documentary you referred to about the Murdochs, and I can't remember if it was Alistair Campbell or who it was that said, you know, that just remember his priorities, you know, which is Murdoch, 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 Murdoch sort of things in his business. So, and I don't know whether that's an whether it's the American dimension of strengthening that. I think with Paul Dacre, it would be, you know, what he would see as a sort of overwhelming last night of the proms, you know, patriotism. I don't think it would be commercial advantage as far as I can think.
The Murdoch, three-part Murdoch series, for example, which is still on, is it Netflix? I can't remember, but well worth and easy to track down, well worth seeing, makes the point that Murdoch and the others as well couldn't get to Brussels. They could have the Prime Minister and their press secretary, director of communications, you know, in their pocket, but they couldn't have that same leverage over Brussels, and hence they couldn't have the same political or even therefore financial influence. That's the point, Sarah.
That's well, that's an interesting. That's a very interesting point.
Okay, let's move on from there. You had anything you want to say about Reader's Digest? Spent a number of years, and there'll be many passionate followers of Readers and indeed I love Reader's Digest too. What were you trying to do there?
I loved that job. I was there briefly because Geordie Gregg came to the Evening Standard and asked if I would come back with him. And I think he sort of released it as a statement of fact before I'd resigned. so there it was. But the Reader's Digest I love because I love the sort of principle behind it. It used to be, you know, long, and this is, I guess, a bit about what it tells you about how the media landscape changed. But it used to be like the biggest magazine in the world, phenomenal.
So were you editor-in-chief of the whole Reader's Digest?
Oh, no, I was UK, but the thing about it was that if your story, so all the material was shared. And so I kind of worked out what would be a perfect story that would get me at least to all the countries except possibly America. So I think, for instance, my first cover was about Edmund Hillary and a cross that had been found, a mystery of a cross that had been found on Everest. And I thought, that's it. That's like the perfect Reader's Digest story. And so it was. And so I thought the idea, so I love the idea that, you know, you just did stories about chasing sharks and that kind of thing. But also, I love the idea of the principle behind it, which was all the things that people, you know, might laugh at now, but like a word a day to learn. And so, and the fact it was quite small was because the idea was that labourers could put it into their overalls and take it out. So moving, isn't it? And you learn a word a day, you know, sort of humour in uniform, whatever it was.
It's a wonderful.
It's a proper blue collar, self-improvement magazine, which I love the idea of. Then, of course, it got sold to private equity, and you know, I think it lost some of that sense of what it was. But it's a beautiful founding concept.
Education is the most important idea that we have really as human beings, and anything that, and civilization, anything that encourages, and Reader's Digest absolutely did. Then in 2012 you went on to people's idea of a dream job, which would be editor of the Evening Standard. What were you doing there? How did you organize your day? Let's take that first. What time did you roll up?
I rolled up. Now seems a sort of wonderful lie-in after the Today programme, but I got there at about, I live locally, I could walk, so I was there about 6:45, 6:45, perfect, AM obviously, and then you would, so then you were working towards the first edition of, so I think everything had to be away by sort of just after 9 for sort of mid-morning first edition. So you were just sort of overseeing, that was mainly, you know, from the night before, and then what you were meant to be chasing.
So what were your discretionary decisions as editor? What were your big decisions every day?
I think there's a sort of, so there's priority of, you know, what stories you think, you know, feature and which are the pictures that should, so you're meant to be in control of, you know, everything. And of course, you know, the big change for editors was everything on the website. So often I would get complaints because, you know, they operate in slightly different principles. You know, the website tended to be people who are sort of younger, less experienced, you know, that the stuff was coming in faster. So I might get a complaint from someone saying, you know, you've put this onto the website, and I might not have even seen it at that point. But you are, so one, responsibility for, you know, whatever happens is your responsibility. Then the things that you do influence, you know, and would spend more time thinking about of, you know, front page, the first sort of, you know, the first few pages, front of city, check sport, and the comment page, and then the leader, which I talked about before. So, you know, what the paper thinks. So you're sort of
Question here from a media student that they'd heard that John Witherow, editor of the Times, Sunday Times before then, reads everything in the paper, nothing gets in the paper. So the question is, did you oversee the classified ads? You know, did you oversee the sport? Would it have made a difference if you had a particular sports team that you wanted, and the arts coverage?
Well, the ads is a very important question, because what you're actually looking at is clashes. So, you know, there's always a thing, you know, for instance, if you, at worst, say your front page is about a plane crash, and you've got a British Airways advertisement, you know, that's going to have to go. So you're, so actually you do look at advertisements. So you need to look at a whole, what's called a flat plan to check against things. And on the sports team is a really interesting one, because that's, again, I think, I do have a sports team actually, but I noticed.
What is it?
It's Chelsea. But I noticed that in conferences, one thing about, you talked about, you know, being amongst men, and I did mostly, and I noticed that one thing that was always that happens in news conferences is you don't comment on the stories apart from, you know, you might add something or say, oh, you know, interesting try so and so or whatever, but on the whole, you're reading out news. When it comes to sport, it's like you'll go, oh, and Liverpool played, well, you'll be pleased about. So then it becomes sort of rather interactive with everyone. And I always thought it was interesting that, imagine if you did that for arts, of going, oh, well, Royal Ballet, and you're going to like this one. So, you know, just would never happen. So it's one of those strange male matey kind of traditions that always interested me.
How did you change the Evening Standard before you handed it over to George Osborne?
Well, it was a sort of two-part thing, because when I joined as deputy under Geordie Gregg, there was a sort of, it was, and this is when I left Heavenly Reader's Digest, and it was only when I arrived that Geordie took me aside and said, you know, we've probably got months before we go under. It's now, this is the big gamble, and it was. You know, it was sort of really hemorrhaging money. And
it was already a free paper, was
no, it wasn't a free paper. It was, but it was hardly selling anything, and it was so something really dramatic had to happen, or you know, we would just go bust basically. So the decision, so the commercial decision was to try making it free. And the editorial decision was how you responded to that. And I think what I was proud of that Geordie and I did was say we behave in the same way. So there's always, you know, temptation. You say, oh, it's free. Well, it doesn't matter what you put in it because people will read anything. And, you know, I think I did say, you know, people should see it as a sort of gift rather than just rubbish, you know, because it's a horror, the idea of you're sort of handing out something to someone and like pushing it at them. So I always thought, you know, make it seem that it's this is a really nice gift.
Coming into the Today programme, what were you asked to do? How much freedom did you have, and how do you think you changed Today, the flagship Radio 4 programme?
Well, the key thing is, as you said at the end, it's flagship Radio 4 programme, so you know you mess around with it at your peril. What I was asked to do was to make it ambitious for guests, the kind of people that we were getting on and the discussions that we were having, and that make it slightly less narrowly focused. And so I think I tried to do that. So in a way, I kind of thought the reason I felt I could do the Today programme in a way I wouldn't have tried other programmes at the BBC, but I sort of thought I can see its relationship with newspapers. You know, it's sort of you're reading, looking at the same time. There's a lot of cross-referencing, and that, you know, I understand about the sort of, you know, the big kind of splash, or, you know, the 810 or whatever. So even the construction, I sort of felt I'd got. So then it was really that, you know, rather than relying on some of the people you just get given, to actually look for, you know, who's saying interesting things. Because I did think one really interesting thing about the Today programme that I didn't realise until I went for the job was that you've got two bosses, you know, so it's under news, but it's also under Radio 4, which is quite unusual sort of. And I thought that first that's rather confusing, and then I thought, oh no, that must be sort of central to its identity. So it was that it's got to be, you know, it's got to be newsy, it's got to be where you can listen to it and think, I now know everything that's going on, and actually it's advanced the news, but also it's got to be more than that. It's not just a rolling news programme. So it's got to be analysis and coverage, and, you know, moments of wonder, and, you know, just a more vivid mix.
So you have 17 hours, I think, of broadcasting a week. How much influence does the editor have, and how does the editor exercise that influence, Sarah?
Well, it's interesting that you do have, although the BBC is very, you know, heavily structured, you do have a marvellous freedom actually on that programme, partly because of the timing, you know, so that by the time the morning news meeting happens to discuss how the stuff.
At what time?
At 9 o'clock.
Right.
I'm done. So you do get a sort of freedom unless you mess up, and then you're straight to the guillotine. So that's the kind of trade-off. So again, it's sort of, as with newspapers, it's sort of total responsibility. And things can happen, you know, as I always sort of remind people that the you know, some of the big things that have blown up, that have taken down the Director Generals, you know, have happened at 6:10. And it was something that James Harding, who took me on, who was head of news, said when I joined, is, you know, that the power you have is to destroy the BBC, you know, so I always, you know, bore that in mind. So that sense of responsibility, and the sense that it's sort of everybody's business, you know, when you edit a newspaper, it's kind of, as long as your readers are all right and they're pretty self-selecting, and proprietors okay, you know, you're sort of you're on your own, whereas, you know, Today programme, everyone has a view and everyone's entitled to a view, you know, so it's a much more public experience. You're
referring there to the 6:10 Andrew Gilligan accusation about sexing up the document about weapons of mass destruction. So did you, for example, choose to get rid of John Humphreys? Can you pick your presenters? Did you feminize the presenters and the guests and make it more BAME?
John Humphreys was all, you know, when I arrived, he said, oh, well, I'll be leaving soon, you know, and and I'm not because of my arrival, I hasten to say, you know, he always said, oh, I should have gone years ago, you know, I'll go. So then it's, you know, John has extraordinary qualities. He has one of the most beautiful voices. I know, I still can hear him in my head saying, you know, it's 6 o'clock and it's John, and also a voice that was totally associated with that programme. He'd been there for 30 years. So actually, the transition of when when someone goes, when someone arrives, you know, all that is cannot be done overnight. So it was really finding a time that that felt right for him. So then, in terms of so you feminized it in terms that because he'd gone, there were 2 men and 2 women, I guess. So that's how you equalised. And I brought in then just some people, to fill in some of the gaps rather than a 5th presenter. So Sarah Smith, John Sokol, people like that. So that what you got was a sense of extended family, I think. So people want familiar voices, I think, but it's quite nice to have a bit of range. You know, I always love when Sarah Smith just talks about the weather, looking out of her window, and she's in Glasgow, and it makes a difference. So that sense of different perspectives, is important.
Is Radio 4 going to be able to hold its own? We talked about the influence of print, journalism, print media. Is it under attack in the same way television is under attack? Times Radio is going to be taking some of Radio 4's listeners away?
Well, particularly since leaving the BBC, I quite like competition, so I don't think it's a bad thing. If there are other places for people to go. I do think that it's that the public service role is so profound, and the BBC depends on that for its survival. So I always think that I'd bring back the Home Service if I could. I think I kind of want it. Absolutely.
Very Tunbridge Wells. Quick fire questions. What was your greatest contribution to the Today programme?
I think to broaden the agenda.
What broadcast?
Bring in new voices, new
and in particular, female, more cultural voices. BAME.
Yes, I think there were people that I was always sort of thrilled to have on. There were writers like Anadeta Roy came on. I'm going
to ask you now, who were you, of all the tens of thousands of guests, who were you most thrilled about in your 3 years?
Well, because it's a news programme, it's sort of the moment. So actually Greta Thunberg at sort of, peak time, her first real sort of big, interview, I was pretty pleased with that.
And which broadcaster has influenced you the most?
Well, the reason that I ever came across the BBC was a journalist called Charles Wheeler.
Charles, a wonderful specialist,
yes.
Great voice, also thin,
great foreign correspondent, and also
hair,
he had US. Yeah, and he had slightly, as John Humphreys did, a sort of actually humility. People don't always associate that with John, but a sense of that you're a reporter. In the end, I love reporters.
And your most influential press journalist or editor?
Well, I guess Stuart Stephen, my first editor, that I really, got to know well and learned a lot from, I guess.
There was somebody who John Major always said he felt treated him fairly. And just finally, what politician, living or dead, or leader, female, male, ungendered, British international, most sums you up, most excites you when you read about them?
I think, and this will divide people on, but it doesn't necessarily my political opinion, but I think Margaret Thatcher was sort of overwhelmingly dominant, you know, for my lifetime. And still, you know, actually talking to Charles more about her, who wrote some books about her, and I said, you know, what above all do you think defined her? And he said, you know, you could trace so much that she was a woman, you know, that that to him was the sort of incredibly important. And I always thought that was interesting.
Indeed, she inspired many people, women and men. She also inspired the University of Buckingham and became Chancellor here at the University of Buckingham after she stood down. Sarah Sands, it's been wonderful to have you as our guest tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you for all those questions, as students and everyone. And Sarah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.